Mike from Retro Boost. Today we're going to be talking about a brand new universal PlayStation controller. It's one that I've been very excited about, tracking the release of, and it's finally here. It's the Retro Fighters Defender. I have the blue one. This is a wireless controller that works for PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, and even Switch and PC. So that's 5 consoles. Oh, and the PS1 classics. That's like 6 consoles in one, basically. Really, really cool. I've been tracking the release of this mainly for the consoles that it supports for PS1, PS2, PS3. As I'm a big, retro gaming enthusiast. Hey, welcome to Retro Boost. Duh. And the PlayStation 3 part of it is really interesting because it's a wireless PlayStation 3 compatible controller that feels good and has great thought put behind its design, and it's not $70+ because the cost of replacing like a name brand DualShock 3, those things are quite expensive. So here's one that's less the price of that and also works on other consoles too. Very good. Is it all as good as it sounds? That's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm kind of going to go over my first impressions and my experience with playing this across PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, and PlayStation 3. Be sure to subscribe as well if you find the video helpful or entertaining. I do appreciate the support. I'm not going to talk about this controller's usage on Switch and PC. I just don't care to use it for those consoles myself. For me, it's more about the older consoles. The PlayStation 1, 2, and 3 is the main focus, what I've been excited for. When it comes to Switch and PC, I really enjoy the Pro controller on Switch and an Xbox controller for PC. But what I will do, in case you were curious my thoughts on that, I will try this out for those, and I'll kind of put my experience in the comments in the description below, and comments as necessary as well. So let's get into it. Let's talk about the design of what we have here today. Taking a closer look at the controller, it's similar to the other controllers the Retro Fighters has released, a couple of which I've talked about before, like the Brawler 64 and the Brawler Gen, which are N64 and Genesis controllers. The ergonomic feel is quite similar. If you're a fan of how those controllers feel in the hand, you'll feel right at home with this one as well. I am. It really brings to mind like Nintendo's Pro controller. That's kind of the first vibe that I get from it. As far as the placement of the sticks, this controller is definitely channeling the spirit of the PlayStation 1, 2, and 3 because the sticks are horizontally equal to each other as opposed to being spread across, more diagonally split, like in a lot of the newer controllers for a lot of consoles have been leaning toward. And then the triggers are the first thing that I noticed that are very different. The PlayStation 1 and 2 controllers had very flat shoulder buttons on the back of them, where then the PlayStation 3 had like kind of a rounded trigger that was more rounded in its design and easier for your finger to roll off the back of, whereas these protrude and extend outward, which means they grip the finger a lot better for like racing games where you have to hold that down for a long time. That's got a nicer feel to it than the PlayStation 3 controllers did. At least I think so. And then we have our face buttons and the D-pad. D-pad's soft and nice. No initial complaints. Just kind of messing around with it right here and now. Face buttons press satisfyingly. They don't stick or anything. No issues there. And then they added a turbo button as well, which is neat. I can't imagine a situation messing with that off the top of my head. Would that be handy? But the flexibility of having it there is welcome. I'm sure there are situations where it might be cool to mess around with. Circling back over to the sticks, they have the indented design that the Brawler Gen also used that I liked very much. It grips thumbs better. That's also something I felt was kind of weak with the PlayStation 2 and 3 controllers, analog sticks. It's easier for your thumb to like slip off them for certain situations. And then PlayStation 4, they added the indent, much like what Microsoft was doing with the Xbox One, and I think even the 360 as well had the indent. So this controller has that as well. So overall, I think the design comes together quite nicely. All the buttons feel good to press. Nothing sticks. The sticks have the indents, so they grip nicely. The trigger with that outward curve also feels good. The overall press of it feels nice too. The top shoulder buttons are a little bulky, but I don't have a problem rapidly tapping it or anything, so, you know, shooter games on PlayStation 3 shouldn't be a problem. And then, of course, it is rechargeable. It uses a USB-C. Great. The bulk of all these new controllers that are being designed like this these days use USB-C. I like the consistency. It's good to see that they're continuing that trend. It'd be kind of weird if they went away with it, really. But the recharge life is supposed to be about 10 hours, I believe, of play between charges. Oh, it does have vibration as well. That was something that was missing from the Brawler 64. Didn't have any kind of vibration to it, but this one does. What it doesn't have for PlayStation 3 consideration, though, is it doesn't have the motion control. They call that a 6-axis. It doesn't have 6-axis. So you get vibration for the games that support that, but you don't get 6-axis. I'm not really sure if that's going to be totally a horrible thing. I'm pretty sure a lot of games that feature was probably optional if it was required. I think like maybe Lair is a game that was like motion centric, but I did see that they are planning on releasing a Bluetooth version of this controller that has 6-axis intended for just PlayStation 3. So if you're looking for a replacement PlayStation 3 controller, and that's what you want specifically, might be worth it to hold out until that version comes to fruition. As far as how it connects to all these consoles, two dongles come in the packaging. One's USB for the PlayStation 3 and like the PC and probably the Switch as well. That's how it connects to those consoles. And then it has a PlayStation 1 and 2 compatible dongle that go into those consoles. And the controller syncs up to it. The sync process is very quick. I've never had it fail. It's always reliably been able to connect like instantly when pressing the home button in the center. So overall, so far so good. I like the design. I like the feel of most of the buttons in the stick, the ergonomic feel in the hands. So let's go over my experience with using it with the PlayStation 1, 2, and 3. For PlayStation 1, I played two different games, Gex and Pac-Man World Adventure, whatever that game's called. I played Gex because I know from previous experiences, Gex is one of those games that was released kind of when it was like the D-pad only controllers, so a chance to really test out a D-pad centric game with the D-pad of the Defender. And overall, I'm kind of mixed on the D-pad's performance. It's a mixture of me and the D-pad. I know it's not the D-pad's fault entirely, but the way that the D-pad's cross is, it's kind of hard for me personally to get my finger in a position where I'm pressing both directions, like 8 directions to move diagonally. I have a hard time kind of like making that work reliably. I think that the strategy, really looking back, is my muscle reflex is to try to like go up and to the right by pressing like up here, but you really could just keep your finger more toward the center and do it. I think that's what's supposed to happen, but if it was a little more rounded, it might have made that a little bit easier. So okay, like it's not uncomfortable to mess around with, but since it is large as it is, I had a hard time personally making Gex work flawlessly. But like I said, it's a mixture of me and probably the game too. Gex isn't the most precise platformer out there, obviously, since it was a D-pad one. But it's worth noting, I did have some like a little bit of difficulty messing around with it. Switching over to the analog controls, I got no complaints. It worked great. Buttons were pressing fine, sticks moving around, no problem. Great. Switching over to Pac-Man in a situation where I'm only using the stick and the buttons, it performed great. It's an excellent controller for PS1. For anyone looking to use the D-pad exclusively, you might have to get used to how I was saying, like, you know, your reflex is to press it far up into the corner to get both of the buttons to press, but you really want to kind of maybe keep it centered a little bit. I'm not really sure what the optimal strategy there is, but analog-wise, it's excellent, and I can absolutely see myself using this going forward all the time for PS1, no issues. So overall, D-pad okay, analog stick control perfect, no complaints. PS1 performance is excellent. PlayStation 2, I played a variety of games, Metal Gear Solid 3, Jak and Daxter, and Burnout Dominator, to get a feel for all the different games like that we can use as much of the buttons as possible. So Burnout, a racing game, this is where I think the buttons are very comfortable. So like Burnout, you have to hold X to go, and keeping my finger depressed on the X button for a long period of time didn't cause any soreness. There's a lot of game consoles I can recall where having to hold a button down, I think PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2 might be one of these, but I'm not really sure. But there are plenty of situations where holding the same button down, your finger starts to get kind of sore and you want to reset yourself for a second. That wasn't really happening here. I think that the buttons, the way that they're shaped and the material they use and how far they depress, it's awesome. I didn't have any problems at all playing Burnout. I even won the race that I did, which to go from, it's a new controller, haven't played that game in God knows how long, and to get in there and win, I'm happy with it. It's great. So no problems there. Switching over to a platformer like Jak and Daxter, controls also fine. Moving around with the left stick, I didn't have any real issues. Nothing with the right stick really either. All the face buttons were remaining responsive, and any mistakes I was making I really can't put on the controller. It's just me having lack of skill from bouncing around so many games in a day and having not touched them in years. So no problem there with the platformer. This is a good chance to really mess around with the top two shoulder buttons, and despite my concerns about how they feel a little bit clunky, they were responsive. No issues there. Just kind of have to get used to the shape, them being a little bit larger than PlayStation 3's shoulder buttons were, and that's kind of what I keep envisioning in my head when I'm pressing them. Moving over to Metal Gear Solid 3, I did have some issues with the sensitivity of the sticks, in particular aiming in first person. Now, some of this is me, because for whatever reason, a lot of these first person sections were like inverted, so controlling them wasn't the most intuitive thing for my brain to try to work around with. But even then, it seems like maybe the dead zone's kind of larger than it needs to be, or it's just the overall sensitivity of it detecting input. I mean, it feels good, but what I'm like delicately moving doesn't seem to necessarily translate to the same delicate movement in game. A small little twitch sometimes would result in a larger move in the game. I started to get kind of used to it though, so I wouldn't call it a major problem. After only playing for 10 minutes after noticing this, I was getting much better at it. So maybe it's just getting used to how this controller responds versus how, say, a PlayStation 2 or 3 controller would have. So overall, still happy with it. Definitely some little bit of oddities there with the sensitivity for aiming and stuff like that, but nothing that I would consider horrible. So overall, PlayStation 2 also really good, and I can definitely see myself making this the main thing I do for PS2 going forward. So now let's get into PlayStation 3. Much like PlayStation 2, I played a racing game, a shooter game, and an action game on PlayStation 3. First, the racing game, MotorStorm Pacific Rift, and again, much like with the Burnout experience, having to hold down some of these buttons for a long term, very easy to do. With MotorStorm, we're holding down the trigger, which is why I wanted to play this game, because this trigger is much easier to hold down and keep held down than a PlayStation 3's controller is. You really can't, you just can't. You can't accidentally lose your grip like you could with the PlayStation 3 controllers, because the PlayStation 3 triggers don't have an edge. They just round off so you can slide your finger off. These have a grip. Since the controller comes outward, your finger can really rest there. So holding this down for a racing game felt great, and it was easy to do. For MotorStorm, I'm very happy with how this controller performed. Switching over to Metal Gear Solid 4, start to see some of those same kind of sensitivity issues that I was running into with PlayStation 2, Metal Gear Solid 3, like aiming. Again, like a very, very precise movement with the stick isn't necessarily translating to the same kind of movement in the game. I was able to do two things. Number one, lowering the sensitivity of aiming in-game kind of helped. Secondly, the more I played with it, I got used to it more. So lowering the sensitivity was like an initial kind of way to compensate for it out of the gate. And then the more I played with it, the more I kind of got used to how I need to mess this around and what movements are going to translate how. And I did fine. I was able to play a game that I'm extremely familiar with adequately. I didn't make any mistakes that I can contribute to the controller sabotaging my efforts. I just had to kind of have to get used to how this controller is performing on PS3 versus an actual DualShock 3. It just seems the stick responds a little bit differently. Maybe it's the dead zone is a little bit larger than it needs to be. Maybe that's what's happening. I don't know. But lowering the sensitivity definitely helped me get used to it quicker. Switching over to an actual first-person shooter game with Call of Duty, that's where this issue became the most noticeable. It definitely was a little bit difficult for me to adjust to how this controller wants to move the cursor. Like a little bit of a move might produce a larger movement in-game. Again, lowering the sensitivity helped me get used to it, and the longer I dealt with it, the more I did get used to it. So, to go from a DualShock 3 to this, like a day apart, depending on who you are, it might cause like a bit of culture shock for you, because it definitely feels and controls a little bit different with aiming in these shooter games. I wouldn't say that it's bad, but there was definitely a learning curve to it. It's interesting, because I only really noticed it when I was like recording for the purpose of like being really analytical. When I just played this casually, the first day that I got it, I played Call of Duty Modern Warfare that day and like went through and actually beat a whole level and was like, yeah, it's pretty good. And then I go into it again for this review and I'm like, all right, time to take notes and whatnot. And now it's like, I'm noticing things here. What's going on? So you may not even notice it if you're not trying to be too analytical. I don't know, but it was definitely a measurable kind of effect there. But largely, performance is still very good. Buttons all press fine. I didn't have any issues with the PlayStation 3 experience beyond the sensitivity. I will say that I've heard people claim that the triggers are very, very sensitive. I never had anything accidentally happen with the games I played. Like, I wasn't firing off grenades by mistake in Call of Duty, for example, which is the trigger's the button for that. So as I continue to play around with it, if that kind of thing does happen, I'll update the description accordingly. So I think PlayStation 3 was probably the weakest performance out of all three of the consoles because of the sensitivity issue, to have to understand that, overcome that, and get used to it. But largely still very good, and price-wise, compared to buying a new DualShock 3, new one, God help you, it's a new one, even a pre-owned one, it's more cost-effective, and it still performs very, very well. Got no complaints, really. So, okay, let's wrap it up. Alright, so what am I thinking? Well, to break it down by console, PlayStation 1, flawless. As a PlayStation 1 controller, I think this is probably the best you'll ever be able to get, personally. I've used DualShock 2s for PlayStation 1. That was probably my preferred experience before this. I've used the original D-pad only controllers, and I've never been a fan of those. I never really tried any other third-party ones though, but other than that, I mean, this is king right here. PlayStation 2 also performed extremely well. Some of the sensitivity problems were a little problematic at first, but I kind of got used to it very quickly and wasn't an issue going forward. So again, I'd say it's excellent for that. PlayStation 3, the sensitivity issues were a little bit more presenting. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it's just because of how the game responds to it. It's supposed to be more dynamic. I don't know. It was a little more noticeable. Again, I got used to it, and lowering sensitivity in game seemed to really help that for some reason. So those are problematic. There's also no 6-axis support, but it does sync very quickly and reliably. It's rechargeable with USB-C, so overall, I'd say it's also excellent for PlayStation 3. And you can't beat the price. I mean, to get this, a wireless, high-quality feeling controller for PlayStation 3 for like 60% the price of buying like an actual pre-owned DualShock 3 that someone's already been touching and then playing with for 10 years. You can't beat that. So overall, excellent package. The problems I had weren't really major, and I got used to them. I'm curious as to if anyone else has experienced those problems with the dead zone / sensitivity of the analog stick for your experience. I never experienced problems with the triggers myself, so maybe we'll be able to trade some stories there in the comments. We'll see. I'll update the description too as I continue to play with this controller, because I absolutely will. I love the feel of it. I love the buttons. I love the trigger, how they grip on the fingers. So I'm definitely going to be using this going forward for all 3 of those consoles as I continue playing games with the channel. Absolutely. So, alright. Thanks for joining me today. Hope the video was helpful in talking about this controller and my experiences with it. Help you decide what you want to do about it. Feel free to subscribe to help me grow the channel, but I do appreciate you watching regardless. Until next time.